Today I'm showing another Metatrader indicator, and this indicator is based on an indicator available in TradingView, and this is the Pivot Point Supertrend indicator. Let me add that to the chart here. Now I've added the Pivot Point Supertrend indicator to the chart. I'll just right click and look at the properties here. So pivot point period of 2, ATR factor of 3, and ATR period of 10. So these are self-explanatory. ATR period, it's calculating an ATR which is used to determine the distance of these support and resistance lines from this center line. ATR factor of 3 means it's multiplying the calculated ATR by 3. And pivot point period, these are not typical pivot points. Pivot point typically is calculated based on a daily price range. This is actually a pivot point as in a recent high or low, and in this case, factor of 2, it's looking for the highest high with 2 bars to either side, or the lowest low with 2 bars to either side. And as you can see, once a support line forms, the line only moves upwards. In some cases it moves upwards because the center line has gone up, and in some cases it moves upwards simply because the ATR may have reduced, which brings this line closer to the center line. But this never goes down. Even though the center line moves down, you can see there's no downward movement of the support line here. And the opposite for the resistance line, it only ever moves down. The support and resistance lines remain in place until the line is broken, not by a wick, as we can see here, but by a close of a candle. So this resistance line stayed in place here, but then ended as soon as this candle closed above the resistance line. And as soon as the resistance line finishes, the support line starts. And the same, the support line finishes here because the next candle closed below the support line, and when that happens, the resistance line forms. This indicator is not readily available in Metatrader, so I'm going to show you how you can write the indicator. And the reason I'm using this indicator is because I'm also working on a tutorial for a strategy that uses this particular indicator. So I need to first create the indicator in Metatrader, and then I can use it in that strategy in the coming weeks. This tutorial is for Metatrader 5. There is an earlier tutorial for Metatrader 4, and I'll leave a link in the description and on screen to the Metatrader 4 version. And here in Metatrader 5 you can see the same indicator, the same patterns here. The scale's obviously a little bit different, and there are some minor variations because of different prices from the different feeds that I'm getting from TradingView and Metatrader. But you can still see that the resistance lines stay in place but only ever move downwards until they are broken by a candle. And then a support line forms, and that will stay in place and only ever move upwards until it is also broken by a candle. So today I'm going to show how to write the code in Metatrader to reproduce this indicator from TradingView. Stay watching to the end, and I'll also show where I think there is a fault in the TradingView indicator. It may not be, it may be intentional, but I'll show you what I think is a fault, and then I'll show you how I would correct this in the Metatrader versions. Now I have the Metatrader 5 MQL5 editor open here. As I normally do, I've got the indicators folder, and I've got my own folder inside this called Orchard, where I'm putting all of my indicators. And I also create a separate folder for each indicator, and then I can keep multiple versions of that inside this one folder, and it keeps them separated from everything else. So I've already created this Pivot Point Supertrend folder. I'm just going to right click that and select New File, and that will open the wizard for Custom Indicator. Calling this Pivot Point Supertrend. I'm not setting any parameters here. I'll do all of that in the code. And I'm also not setting any plots here. I'll also do that in the code. And note, indicator in separate window, that is not checked. This is an indicator in the same window. And finish. Now I'm just going to reformat this a little because I don't like the way the comments are laid out by the wizard. So I'm just going to reformat this, and then we'll carry on. All right, the reformatting's done. Standard comments, properties, copyright link conversion, property indicator underscore chart window, because this draws lines on the main chart. Now I need to set up how many buffers and plots, the difference between buffers and plots. Buffers are storing data, and plots are things actually shown on the screen. And I have a different number of those, and you'll see why in a moment. So I actually have 6 buffers for this indicator and only 3 plots. The 3 plots are going to be the support line, the resistance line, and the midline. So next I'm going to define values for indicator buffer number 1. And I do that with hash property indicator underscore color and then the number of the indicator, 1. And I'm just saying the color is firebrick, it's a width of 2, it's a line with type, style is style solid, and label, which appears in the data window on the left of Metatrader, is resistance. So the resistance line is a red solid line. I'll do the same for the support line and the midline. Color green and color yellow, and note that these numbers have changed. So this is number 2 for the second line and number 3 for the third line. Width 2, line solid, and support is the label that appears in the data window. For the third line, mid appears in the data window, but I'm making this one a style dot and width 1. Now I have the 3 additional buffers, which are just for working values. So the difference between buffers 6 and plots 3, I'm just adding hash property indicator type 4, 5, and 6 is drawn none, so they won't be drawn. Next I have the input statements. INP period is for finding those high and lows. Remember, they are not really pivot points as I would normally term them, where a pivot point is determined based on a daily price movement. These are in fact the number of bars to the left and right of a bar to find a high or a low. So a new pivot will form if any bar is a high and the 2 bars to either side of it are lower, or if it's a new low and the 2 bars to either side of that are higher. The ATR factor is a multiple of the ATR calculation, and that separates the support and resistance lines from the midline by this factor. Although remember that those support and resistance lines do move closer, so they can move closer than this, but they can't move further away than this ATR factor. And ATR period is just used to calculate the ATR. Now I need to create arrays that are going to hold the values that match up with those 6 buffers. Each of these arrays is a double because they're holding price values. And I'm calling them buffer resistance, buffer support, buffer mid, and these are dynamic arrays, you'll note with bracket here. And then the 3 working arrays, buffer upper and lower, they actually hold values that map to this resistance and support, but where resistance and support only show when there is either the resistance or the support, the upper and lower will have values always, but these won't be displayed anywhere on screen, they're only working values. And buffer last is going to hold the value of the most recently found high or low pivot point. Also, to calculate the ATR, I need to set up a handle to the ATR indicator and a buffer where I'm going to retrieve the values of that ATR. So the handle is an integer, handle ATR, and I'm initializing that to invalid handle. And then the buffer where I'm going to hold the values for that ATR, I'm just calling buffer ATR, and that's another dynamic double array. In the onInit function, the first thing I'm going to do is set the number of digits that will display in the data window. By default, that would be 4, but I'm going to be using instruments that typically price to 5 digits, so I just want to show the same number of digits in that window. I do that with indicator set integer, indicator underscore digits, 5. And now I need to match these buffers to the indicators. I do that with the set index buffer statement. I'm saying set index buffer number 0. Now, if we scroll back up here, you'll see that I started counting here at 1. That's because with these property statements, the indicators counts are 1 based. But when I use set index buffer, the counters are 0 based. So these are offset by 1 from the values in the property statements above. So index buffer number 0 is mapped to the buffer resistance array, and it's an indicator data type. And then the same buffer number 1 and 2 are mapped to the support and the mid buffers. Mapping these firstly says that the values in these arrays are what's going to be used to show the lines on screen. But secondly, it makes these arrays resize and automatically move as new bars are created on screen. So if a new bar appears on screen, each of these arrays will get an extra element in the array. And if I've reached the maximum number of bars on screen and a bar disappears, then each of these will have that same matching element removed from the array. I also want to indicate and set that the empty value for each of these is going to be a 0. And I do that with plot index set double. Again, the buffer numbers 0, 1, and 2 I'm saying that the plot empty value is 0. And I also need to associate these 3 working value arrays with the appropriate buffers. The statements are very much the same as above. Set index buffers, in this case 3, 4 and 5, buffer upper, lower and last, but these are indicator calculations. And now this handle to the ATR, I only need to set that up once, and then I can use the handle any number of times throughout the code. So I'm going to set the ATR indicator here in the onInit. Handle ATR equals IATR function. Arguments are symbol bracket bracket, that's the chart symbol, period bracket bracket is the chart period, and the input of the ATR period. So that sets up the handle to the ATR. If that fails, then I'm testing if handle ATR is equal to invalid handle, then I simply return init failed because I can't proceed without having an ATR. And then the next thing I want to do is make sure that each of these buffers are arranged in the same direction as the bars on screen. So I want element number 0 of each of these buffers to match with bar number 0 on the screen. And by default, that's not the case. By default, element number 0 of these arrays would be the leftmost bar on the screen. And I fixed that just with array set as series, each of the buffers, comma, true. And I'm also including in here the ATR buffer. I haven't used that yet, but I'm saying that that is also going to be arranged so that element 0 from this buffer matches bar number 0. That just makes it easier for me later when I'm looking at values and matching them to bars. I don't need to do the math to work out which number element from the array I use. It's going to be the same as the bar number. Array set as series for each of the 6 buffers that are on screen plus the ATR buffer, all set to true. Now the wizard didn't create an onDinit, but I need one. Because I've created this handle to the ATR, I need to release that indicator when I've finished. And that just frees up memory and resources. So onDinit, I simply say indicator release handle ATR, and that releases that indicator from use. And now on calculate. First let me talk about some of the values that are passed into this function. Rates total is the total number of bars or rates that are available. Prev calculated is the number that I've already processed, and that comes from this value. So each time this is returned, the next time this function is called, the value in this return statement comes back in this prev calculated. And I can use that to determine how many bars I have not calculated yet, which is good if a new bar forms and so on. These values, these arrays, time, open, high, low, close, and tick volume, volume, and spread, all match prices from the array of bars. So open is the array of open prices, high, low, and close, and so on. I'm going to be using close, high, and low in the calculations here, but these arrays, just like before, are not in the same sequence as the bars on screen. So I include these statements, arrays set as series close, low, and high to true. And that simply puts them in the same order as the bars on screen so that when I use them, I can look at close 0 and get the closing price for bar number 0, for example. I'm declaring 2 working values, PP last and PP mid. So PP last will hold the last value pivot point found, whether that's a high or a low. And PP mid will hold the midpoint of the channel. Because I'm looking for those pivot points and they need to have a certain number of bars to both the left and the right, I can't do anything if I don't have enough bars to at least do that calculation. And the number of bars I need is 2 times the input period plus 1. So that's input period to each side plus the bar in the middle. And if I haven't got at least that many, I can't find either a high or a low. So if rates total is less than pivot width, then I just return 0. That 0 will come back in next time as prev calculated, and prev calculated on the first call to this function is going to be 0 anyway. So this will simply keep looping around until I have at least enough bars to perform the calculation to find a high or low pivot point. And now I mentioned that I can use rates total and prev calculated to know how many bars I need to perform the calculation on. In the first call to this, prev calculated is 0, so I need to calculate everything. After that, prev calculated is as many bars as I processed last time because I'm returning rates total here. And so I need to perform a calculation that just tells me how many bars I actually need to run through. So I'm using this variable int count is equal to rates total minus prev calculated. Right, so that tells me how many bars I have not already processed. But if I have processed bars already, then bar number 0 is possibly changing simply because the prices are changing on bar number 0. And also, if I have one new bar created, I need to recalculate the bar number 1 because the price may have changed on that between the last time I ran through this calculation and now, and then I need to recalculate bar number 0. And I can handle all of that with this if prev calculated is greater than 0, which means I've been through here at least once, count plus plus, just add 1 to the count. But I also can't perform processing on anything too far to the left because I need to allow that pivot width again. So I have another test. If count is greater than rates total minus pivot width, then count equals rates total minus pivot width. So that just makes sure that I leave that many bars to the left-hand side. And now I'm going to capture the ATR values for as many bars as I know that I'm going to calculate. I get values from the ATR with copy buffer, passing in the handle to the ATR, the buffer number that I want to get values from this ATR indicator, and an ATR indicator only has one buffer, so it's buffer number 0. Which bar number I want to start with to get values back, how many values I want to get back, and that's count, and where I want to store those values, and that's the buffer ATR array. So I know that I'm going to be processing count bars. I know that I want to start at bar number 0, and I know it's the handle ATR, so I simply use the copy buffer that fills up buffer ATR with that many values. Copy buffer may fail, or there may not be enough data available to return everything I want. So if copy buffer is less than count, so if I didn't get enough values back, then I just return 0, which means that next time I come in here, I will recalculate everything. And now a simple loop through all of those bars for int I equals count minus 1. So I count minus 1 because as many bars as I know I need to perform the calculation on, the array is 0 based. So count minus 1 gives me the highest numbered bar that I need to process. While I is greater than or equal to 0, I'm going all the way down to bar number 0. I minus minus decrements I, so I'm counting from high to low. First, I'm grabbing the working value for this last pivot point, and I'm storing those in the buffer last array. So by looking at buffer last I plus 1, I'm simply grabbing what was the most recent value known for that. And then I'm going to check to see if a new pivot has formed. So first, bool update mid equals false. That will tell me whether I need to recalculate the midpoint. I only need to recalculate the midpoint if a new pivot forms. So I'm just setting that to false to begin with, and I'll reset it if I do find a new pivot. In these lines, I'm looking at the low pivot, so a new low has formed. So int low pivot bar is equal to I lowest, symbol bracket bracket, that's the chart symbol, chart period, mode low, I'm looking at the low prices, pivot width tells me how many bars I'm looking at, and that is number of bars to each side by 2 plus 1 in the middle. So the default number of bars is 2, therefore pivot width by default is going to be 5. Beginning at bar number I. So this will give me the bar number that has the lowest low price in this range. I plus INP period is the bar number that is exactly in the middle of that, and that's what I'm looking for. I want to know if that bar is the lowest bar over this range, pivot width range. So if low pivot bar is equal to the middle bar, then I know that I've found a new low. And so PP last now is equal to low, that's that array that's passed into the function. It's equal to the low price for low pivot bar. And update mid becomes true. That takes care of a new low pivot bar. Very similar for a high pivot bar, but in this case I'm using I highest and mode high to find the highest price. Same test here, if high pivot bar is equal to the mid bar, then PP last is equal to high pivot bar. Now you'll note that in case I have a bar that forms both a high and a low pivot, this value will override this value, and that's by choice. I can only have one value, and I've decided that the high pivot bar will override the low. And then update mid is the same. So now the calculations for that midpoint. First, just as I did with the last, PP mid is equal to buffer mid I plus 1, so I'm just grabbing the most recent value for the mid buffer. If update mid, so if I have found a new high or low pivot bar, then firstly, if PP mid is equal to 0, so that happens to the very left of the chart where I haven't set a midpoint yet. If PP mid is equal to 0, then PP mid is equal to PP last. So the midpoint is simply going to be whatever the pivot point is that has been found. If not, then I already have a midpoint and I'm calculating a weighted average to move that midpoint based on the new pivot point found. So the mid is now equal to mid by 2, mid multiplied by 2, plus that last pivot point found, all of that divided by 3. That gives me the weighted average for a new midpoint. So now that I've done the calculations and I have any new pivot points found with PP last and a new midpoint with PP mid, which may be the same as the earlier value if nothing's changed, I'm reassigning those now to the most recent bar. So buffer last I equals PP last and buffer mid I equals PP mid. If PP mid is still equal to 0, which again should only happen to the very left of the chart, then I simply continue, which will go to the next iteration of this loop, of this for loop, because I can't calculate anything further if I have not got a midpoint. Next, I want the ATR values, so I can calculate the distance that the support and resistance lines should be away from that midpoint. So double ATR, and I'm just pulling that value from the ATR buffer. So double ATR equals buffer ATR I. There's a deviation then, because I have this ATR factor, which by default is 3. So deviation is simply ATR multiplied by that factor. Then this upper value is just midpoint plus the deviation, and the lower value is midpoint minus the deviation. And now I want to update these working buffers, the buffer lower and buffer upper, based on these values that are found. For the buffer lower, if the close price for element number I, current bar that I'm processing, is above the previous value of buffer lower, I plus 1, then I can simply take math max, lower, and the previous lower. So in other words, if lower is higher than the previous lower, then I simply take that new value and that goes into buffer lower I. That's if the close I is still above the lower. If the close I is not above the lower, then I've broken that lower line and I just reset then to lower, which is going to be ATR by this factor, the deviation, below the midpoint. So as soon as the close goes below that lower line, I take a step down, and as long as close remains above that lower line, then I simply move it closer by the math max of lower and buffer lower. Buffer upper is just the opposite. In this case, if close I is less than the previous upper buffer, then I take the math min of upper and buffer upper, and if close is not less than that value, then it means I've pierced that, I've broken that line, and I reset to the upper value. Now that takes care of the calculations for these working arrays, but remember that the upper and lower support lines, the support and resistance lines, only show one at a time, and in between the other line simply doesn't appear, where these buffer lower and buffer upper are continuous. So what I want to do now is map those onto the support and resistance lines, along with some calculations to know which of those two lines should be showing. So looking at the support line first, if buffer support I plus 1 is not equal to empty value, that means that I already have a support line in place, and I can only either have support or resistance lines. I can't have both. So I have a support line. If close I, bar I'm currently processing, is less than buffer support from the previous bar, then it means I've broken the support line. And in that case, buffer support I equals empty value, so I'm removing the support line, and buffer resistance I is equal to buffer upper I, which comes from here. So I'm simply switching between support and resistance if the close price has broken that support line. If the close price didn't break the support line, else buffer support I is equal to buffer lower I, which just comes from here. Now that's in the case where I have a support line in place. As I said, I can only either have support or resistance. I can't have both. It is possible at the very left of the chart to have neither. So this statement is a little bit different. if buffer resistance I plus 1 is equal to empty value. So if it's equal to an empty value and I'm in here, then it means I'm on the very left of the chart and I don't have anything, so I'm just going to start, or the close I is greater than the resistance. So this is the same as the line above. This is where the close has now broken the resistance line. So if I either have nothing or close has broken the resistance, then I'm going to switch to being a support, and I do that with buffer resistance is equal to empty value and buffer support is equal to buffer lower. Else, which means that I have a resistance line in place and I haven't broken it, I simply update buffer resistance I is equal to buffer upper I. And then I can just end the for loop there. And that should be everything. But before we go to the chart, I've realized I've made a mistake here. I shouldn't be using empty value here. I should be using a 0. Now, one more thing I've forgotten in the Metatrader 5 version here. In the case where I have a support line and it's not broken, I actually need to make sure that the resistance line is set to 0, just to make sure that the memory is being cleared out. So just buffer resistance I is equal to 0. And also here, buffer support I is equal to 0 when I have a resistance line. Without those, it's possible that there is residual memory in these elements of the array, and that will cause the lines to show incorrectly. And if I now drag the Pivot Point Supertrend onto the chart, period 2, factor 3, ATR period 10, okay. And you can see there we're getting the patterns we expect, where I have a resistance line here. When that's broken by a close above the resistance line, a support line forms. If I scroll a little to the left, I have a support line here. That's broken by a close below the support line, and then the resistance line forms. And the resistance line only ever moves lower, and the support line only ever moves up. And now I'll show what I think is the problem with this indicator in TradingView. Just to make it easier to see, I'm firstly going to add the ATR indicator. And then I'm going to modify the settings on this Supertrend indicator to have a distance of 1 ATR from the center line. So that I've reduced the ATR factor to 1. Now if I just move over one of these points where the center has moved upwards, so here for example, the center has just moved up, I can see that the support line is at 05227 and a center line is at 05380. And that's a difference of 00163, which is probably a rounding difference, but very close to what we can see as the ATR there is 00162. If I move to another point where the same thing has happened, just here for example, the support line is at 05080 and the center line is at 05296, which again is very close to the size of 1 ATR, which is 210. But if I move to this point where the resistance line has ended and the support line has been created, the support line is at 4874 and the center line is at 4909, which is a difference of only 00035, where the ATR is currently at 188. Now the reason I think this is a fault, the standard Supertrend indicator will begin the support and the resistance lines at the ATR multiple away from the center, where this indicator is not. When the support flips to resistance or resistance flips to support, these lines are often much closer to the center, and that's because it has been tracking the ATR even when these lines don't appear, and it doesn't do anything to reset that distance away from the center line when the support and resistance flip. That may be intentional, I don't know. You already have the code to write this indicator in Metatrader exactly as it is written here. I'm now going to show how I would correct that problem on the Metatrader side such that this point in the support line will be 1 ATR or multiple of ATR away from the center line. Now back to the MQL5 chart, and I'll just change the settings on this indicator to also 1 ATR. I'm changing the ATR factor to 1. And you can see that, again, this support line is very close to the midline. And when the resistance forms here, it's very close to that midline. And to fix that is very simple. Now, as I said, this may or may not be a fault, but if you wanted to have these lines separated by the appropriate ATR gap from the midline when you flip from support to resistance and resistance to support, then here's how I would fix that. So to make sure that this resistance line is set an appropriate distance away, it's as simple as inserting this line, buffer upper I is equal to upper. That simply resets that value in case where I've had the flip between the support and resistance. And the same here in the resistance line, buffer lower I equals lower. And so here I still have the pivot point supertrend with an ATR factor of 1. And you can see a much larger gap here from the midpoint to the line. So that's it for the pivot point supertrend indicator in Metatrader. As I said, I am creating this indicator because I'm going to be using it very soon in an expert advisor that implements a strategy that uses this particular indicator. So stay watching for that. If you found this useful, then please click the like button. And if you want to see more of our videos, including that coming video of the expert advisor for this strategy, then click subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when we release new videos. Until the next time, thank you for watching.